I'm standing here at the Voortrekker monument in Pretoria, and together with me is Christo, Rabie. Can you please tell me, who are the Boer people and how did you end up in Africa, of all places?
It's a long story. I'll try to make it short. We are all from European descent. So my ancestors could be German, could be French, could be British, could be from the Netherlands mainly. In Europe in the 1600s, there was this global reconnaissance of the different continents, and especially through trade. When Europe started to do trade with the East, they started to investigate the routes on sea. And with the Dutch, in 1652, they established, let's call it a little tuck shop in Cape Town, especially to replenish their ships with water and meat and vegetables, that kind of stuff, what they needed. And that's actually where it started. So the intention was not to form a colony, the intention was to form a halfway station on their way to the east. And with time, people started to settle and people started to farm. Many of the sheep farmers, it could be local sheep, it could be sheep brought into South Africa as well. Those sheep farmers started moving more into the Northern Cape and into the Eastern Cape. So let's say more or less by 150 years later, you have a situation where there's a lot of farmers in the Eastern Cape area, especially where the Fish River was recognized more or less as the main, how do you put that? It was the main, help you met Engels hierso. Your grens, your border. Yes. So let's try it again. So in the Eastern Cape, you have more or less a situation where the Fish River was recognized as the border between the Xhosa-speaking people north of the river and south of the river. Still not really the Afrikaner people yet, not really speaking Afrikaans properly yet, because there was quite a transformation in languages. Picking up from the different European languages and integrating them, as well as from the local Khoi languages. So these people lived in that area for quite some while, and there was a lot of conflict between the Xhosa-speaking people and the people living there south of the river. A lot of cattle raiding happened. There were like 8 or 9 different wars between them. A lot of cattle raiding especially. I'm tempted to say it's estimated more or less 50,000 cattle form part of this story. So you steal mine, I'll steal yours, you burn my house, I burn your house. So that was quite a nasty bit of the history. And when the British took over the Cape Colony in 1806, my ancestors from the Eastern Cape decided they are not going to stay here any longer. They feel Britain did not protect them. They feel that the British forced upon them English language in the schools, as well as in the economic system and in the courts. So they decided to move. And also remember, Britain was extremely progressive in thinking. So the British also abolished slavery, and it was general practice all over the world, not only here. And my ancestors decided they're going to move away from the Eastern Cape. So to make a long story short, most of them decided to move to KwaZulu-Natal, south of the Tukela River, because south of that river it was not that much occupied by Zulu-speaking people. So when they entered the interior of South Africa, it was quite a large movement, because we talk about more or less 20,000 people on the move. It's not only men, women and children as family groups, it's also servants who moved with them. Now those servants are sometimes referred to as slaves. There's still a lot of debate about that. Now with moving into the interior, the first conflict again was in the northern section of the Free State, because the Matabele people were living there. The Matabele people come from the Zulu nation under Mzilikazi. They moved away from KwaZulu and they have driven out most people living in the interior of South Africa. Even Tswana-speaking people who have lived here where we are today for more than 400 years, also those people were driven out as far as Lorutsi and Botswana. Now, with the Great Trek, with so many people moving in and starting to settle, they found in the Botswana people here a perfect partner who also did not want the Matabele people here because there was a lot of cattle raiding and a lot of fighting. So with the Botswana and my ancestors who moved in here, they actually drove out the Matabele people and they still live in Zimbabwe to where they fled. So you will find in Zimbabwe a number of surnames that are very similar to the Nguni languages in South Africa. So for us it feels very similar because we also still have similar surnames to our European ancestors. Now, one big part of this 20 years of moving into South Africa is with the movement into Natal to settle there, there was a lot of conflict for more or less 9 months. Now, after that conflict under the leadership of the Zulu King Dingane and the Boer leader or the Afrikaner leader Retief, after signing a treaty to settle there was a lot of conflict, let's say for more or less a year period. And after Dingane was defeated by the Afrikaners at the Battle of Blood River, after that came a complete different leadership from the Zulu people under King Mpande, and my ancestors settled in Natal for more or less 4 years. In 1843, the British occupied Natal and they colonized Natal. And most of my ancestors decided they are not going to live under British rule and they moved out of Natal. And then they occupied 2 large areas which we recognize today as the old Orange Free State, Boer State. And north of that, between the Vaal River and the Limpopo River, they occupied what we know today as 4 new provinces. They occupied the Old Transvaal or the South African Republic. And I think the most famous person perhaps who was part of the Great Trek is Paul Kruger. And Kruger eventually became the president of this Boer state, the ZAR, South African Republic. And Kruger remained as president until 1902. And we know by now these 2 republics had a profound influence on the history of South Africa. You talk about economic development, you talk about formation of towns, infrastructure like roads, bridges, railway lines, but also a profound influence on the local cultures here, because people's culture started to change, a different way of eating, a different way of settling, a different, new economic opportunities. So that influenced this northern section of South Africa so much. So if you look at Pretoria today, then you try to remember it's more or less 180 years later, and look what has happened. So, and we contribute that more or less to the big movement or the Great Trek, and that is the story which this monument is telling.
Nice. And these 2 Boer states, of that one of the Free State and Transvaal, did that have international recognition?
Actually, treaties were signed between the Boer leaders as well as the British, who were part of the colony, and they were actually requested to sign a document to recognize that my ancestors are independent, they are on their own, they are out of the Cape Colony, they are out of KwaZulu-Natal, or Natal in those days. And these documents were signed as a recognition from the British side. But of course, no local treaties, because everyone who came in, whether it be British or Huguenots or the Vryburgers from the Dutch group, all of these people simply moved in and they started either to occupy or they started to interact with local cultures.
Would you say, is it a difference between the 2 Boer nations and that of the Cape Colony? Because it sounds like you were building a nation and you were not colonizers. You were not here to extract resources to bring back to Europe.
Well, the interesting thing is you will notice in academic papers after the British colonized, there was an enormous influence in the economic flow between South Africa and Europe. Before that, actually not really that much. There was interaction between local people growing food or planting cotton and exporting those, but not as much as after the British. The British were extremely progressive economically as well as in their thinking. Under Paul Kruger and with the two local Boer states, you will find that Kruger was more interested in people surviving and people being on farms. So their way of living was more subsistence farming. So it is more for survival. It was only with large British influence, and you will find in late Victorian times with a lot of British influence. And after the Boer War, after 1902, you will find there was much more progressive economic activity. I think Afrikaners were, in that way, simply happy to farm and to continue with that way of living. So the British actually then, in that regard, they also influenced Afrikaners, and the way of thinking of Afrikaners, they influenced it a lot.
So you lost this to Boer nation after the Anglo-Boer War in 1902.
That's right.
And what happened is 1902 is the birth of the South Africa that we see today.
What actually happened after that is that all the colonies, you refer to the Cape Colony, the Orange Free State, South African Republic, and also the section annexed by the British, that is Natal. All of those were joined as one single, I'm not sure if you should refer to it as a country yet. And the main purpose of the British was to unite the Afrikaners as well as the British. Because Afrikaners were initially very opposed to British culture and British language. I think actually the 20th century, the government of 20th century, was actually simply a process for Afrikaners to reposition. It was quite a slow process to reposition themselves in a global context because they were not that much focused on it. Actually, Paul Kruger already was focused on it. He wanted to build a railway line from Pretoria to Lorenzo Marx or Maputo, and many Afrikaners objected to that as well. So we are very slow learners and very slow to change, but it's quite interesting. I'm tempted to say after 1994, Afrikaners seem to have adapted that much that we are prone to any possible change. If something changes, we are there to observe and already to position ourselves and to ask ourselves the question, how are you going to handle these changes now?
During the two Boer states, did the black surrounding tribes respect the Afrikaners' sovereignty?
It's interesting, you will see inside this building the 20 years history of our pioneer phase. There are very good examples where local chiefs and Afrikaners cooperated and worked together. So you also have the good stories of people cooperating for both, like Botswana, like also after Mpande with the Zulu nation, that they cooperated and it was for the betterment of all groups. So you will find that's also part of the story of the past.
And one last question just to clarify. The first interaction with the blacks were the Xhosa tribe at the Fish River border.
Well, slightly further back, of course, in Cape Town, you also have strandlopers or Khoi people. You also have sand people there.
How do those people separate from the Zulu and the Xhosa?
What we know today as Western Cape and section of the Eastern Cape, Northern Cape as well, are areas that were occupied by the Khoi people and the San people. I know we refer to Khoi San, but it's not correct because Khoi and San are completely different cultures. But these cultures have occupied that area first. And when I refer to conflict more than 180 years ago on the Fish River border, that conflict, strange enough, has resulted in colonial or even modern borders of provinces, but you will find there's a large influx of Xhosa people now in the Western Cape. So
And,
it's a much later happening.
And just one last question. Which is the dominated black tribes in South Africa today?
I'm tempted to say, thinking of numbers, it could be perhaps the Nguni nation. Now, Nguni we refer to as the Swazi speaking, the Zulu speaking, and the Xhosa speaking. Remember, 100 years ago, now let's go slightly further back, let's say 1890s, with gold discovered here on the Witwatersrand. There were not a single Zulu-speaking person here, but with migration laborers, so many of them left Natal and they came here, similar with people from Malawi, similar with Chinese, who came to South Africa to work on the mines. And today you'll find, for instance, it's like 130 years later, one of the major languages in Gauteng already is isiZulu, simply because of economic happenings and how people go after work.
All right, thank you.
Okay.
Do you consider yourself European or African?
I've never been in Europe before.
Yeah.
I would like to go and visit a few spots one day. I've been in the East more, other interests, but I consider myself an African.
Okay.
Yeah. It depends. I think in many cultures with many minority groups, you will always sit on two seats. Another Afrikaner will say, I'm Afrikaner first, then South African. Another person will say, but I feel like South African first and then Afrikaner. You will always sit on these two different seats.
So it's those two different seats. It's not, okay, I'm an Afrikaner and then second I'm a Dutchman. It's, I'm an Afrikaner and then second I'm a South African.
We always had it like this.
Okay.
We always had it like people have more closer attachment to certain identity.
Yeah.
You can't prescribe to people how they should think or feel. But one Afrikaner will say, but I feel like a South African. For me, it's the most important thing. I'm here to stay.
Yeah.
Another person will say, but my Afrikaans identity is more important to me. So, but it does not take away, but I feel I'm a South African as well.
Yeah.
So you always have this ambivalent attitude of you have two different identities. The notion of a South African nation, we are working on it, but I'm not sure where it will go. I think no one is sure, but we know there are shared values, and hopefully shared values may perhaps unite us as a nation. Then it has nothing to do with the language you speak, and I think this is where we are still today. I think that I'm taking a guess. I think that many people who attach identity closer to being Afrikaans than South African, I think it's simply a matter of you don't always agree with value systems that you see and things that's happening. And I think you kind of detach yourself slightly from that, and then you might identify yourself rather as Afrikaner than South African, because there are too many things happening, and we are seriously awaiting good, strong new leadership for the country.
And for those people that say that the white man doesn't belong in Africa at all?
Well, I'm not certain what I should say to that, because they should look at Europe, because Europe is setting the example. I mean, for the past few hundred years, there are people from Africa, from the Middle East who go to Europe and they become part of that culture. So I think people need to observe other cultures and how they handle not racial color, but also cultural differences. So hopefully we can learn from that as well.